The interview lasted less than 10 minutes. Before the single dad reached the parking lot, he had already accepted another rejection. But inside the boardroom, one forgotten document, one familiar name, and one shocking realization made the billionaire CEO sprint after the man everyone had just turned away. What happened next changed both of their lives forever. Michael Carter stood outside the tall glass building for a few seconds before walking in. He looked at the company logo, straightened his old navy blue tie, and took one slow breath. His suit had been carefully ironed the night before, even though it was several years old. The leather briefcase in his hand had faded at the corners, but he carried it with quiet pride because it had followed him through every important stage of his career. At 42 years old, Michael wasn't nervous because he lacked experience. He was nervous because this interview felt like his last real chance. For almost 2 years, life had pushed him from one temporary job to another after the manufacturing company where he had worked for nearly 15 years suddenly closed its doors. Since then, he had delivered packages, worked overnight shifts in warehouses, and taken any honest job he could find. None of those jobs paid enough to cover the mortgage, school expenses, and everyday bills. Every decision he made was for one person waiting at home, his 10-year-old daughter Emma. After losing his wife to cancer 4 years earlier, Michael had promised himself that no matter how difficult life became, Emma would never feel that she had lost both parents. She was the reason he woke up every morning and refused to give up. Inside the reception area, everything looked expensive. Large marble floors reflected the bright lights above, employees walked confidently through the lobby carrying laptops, and giant screens displayed the company's latest achievements. Michael quietly checked in with the receptionist and took a seat. Around him sat younger candidates wearing expensive watches, tailored suits, and confident smiles. Some spoke loudly about business schools, promotions, and leadership programs. Michael didn't join their conversations. Instead, he reached into his briefcase and looked at a small drawing Emma had slipped inside before he left home that morning. It showed the two of them holding hands with the words, "Good luck, Dad, I know you'll get it." He smiled, folded it carefully, and placed it back inside the briefcase. A few minutes later, his name was called. Michael walked into the interview room where 3 people were waiting for him: the Human Resources Director, the Chief Operating Officer, and a young recruitment manager. They welcomed him politely, but as the interview continued, the atmosphere slowly changed. They seemed more interested in the years he had spent unemployed than in the 15 years he had successfully managed large operations. They asked why someone with his background wanted to return to a regular management position. One interviewer even wondered aloud if he would be comfortable reporting to supervisors much younger than himself. Michael answered every question honestly. He never exaggerated his achievements or complained about the hardships he had faced. He simply explained that work was work, and providing for his daughter mattered more than pride or job titles. The interview ended much sooner than Michael had expected. The panel thanked him for coming and told him they would contact him if they decided to move forward. Michael had heard those words many times before, so he understood what they usually meant. He stood up, shook each person's hand with a respectful smile, picked up his worn briefcase, and quietly walked out of the room. No one stopped him. No one asked another question. To the interview panel, he was simply another candidate who hadn't made the final cut. But just a few minutes after Michael stepped out of the building and started walking toward the parking lot, something inside that interview room would make everyone realize they had made a mistake they could never have expected. Michael had barely reached the parking lot when the interview room returned to its normal routine. The Human Resources Director closed Michael's file and placed it on top of a stack of other applications. The recruitment manager stood up to prepare the room for the next candidate, while the Chief Operating Officer checked his watch and reminded everyone they were already running behind schedule. To them, Michael Carter was simply another applicant who had not been the right fit. His interview was over, and within seconds, everyone had already moved on. As the recruitment manager gathered the papers from the table, a small folded document slipped out of Michael's old briefcase folder and landed on the floor without anyone noticing. She picked it up, expecting it to be another copy of his resume, but instead it was an old employee recognition certificate. The paper had turned slightly yellow with age, yet the company logo printed at the top looked strangely familiar. She frowned and called the HR director over. "Have you ever heard of Carter Industrial Systems?" she asked. Dark clouds had gathered while he was inside the building. A cool wind swept across the parking lot, and within seconds, light rain began to fall. Michael pulled his old coat a little tighter and continued walking toward the city bus stop at the end of the street. He didn't look back once, There was no reason to. As far as he knew, the interview was over, and the company had already moved on to someone else. Inside the headquarters, however, everything had changed. Daniel Bennett hurried through the lobby with Michael's resume still in his hand. Employees stopped what they were doing as the billionaire CEO passed by at a pace they had never seen before. His executive assistant called after him, asking if he needed security or if his next meeting should be delayed, but Daniel ignored every question. His only concern was finding Michael before he disappeared into the afternoon crowd. By the time Daniel reached the front entrance, Michael was already halfway to the bus stop. Without thinking twice, Daniel stepped into the rain and called out, "Mr. Carter." The sound of his name echoed across the nearly empty street. Michael slowed down but didn't turn around immediately. He assumed someone had simply forgotten paperwork or wanted him to sign a visitor form. When he finally looked back, he froze. The billionaire CEO himself was jogging toward him through the rain, his suit getting soaked as employees watched in complete disbelief from the building's glass entrance. Daniel finally caught up, slightly out of breath. "I'm glad I found you," he said. Michael looked confused. "I'm sorry," he replied politely. "Did I leave something behind?" Daniel shook his head. "No." For a brief moment neither man spoke. Michael broke the silence first. "If this is about the interview, you don't have to explain. I understand. You chose someone else and that's perfectly fine." Daniel looked him straight in the eyes. "No, Mr. Carter, that's not why I'm here." Michael frowned. "Then, what is this about?" Daniel held up the resume. "I need you to come back inside." Michael almost smiled, thinking there had been some kind of misunderstanding. "I appreciate that, but if this is another interview, I don't think it's necessary. You already made your decision." Daniel answered immediately. "We made that decision before we knew who you really were." Those words only confused Michael even more. "I think you've mistaken me for someone else," he said quietly. Daniel slowly shook his head. "I don't think so." By now, dozens of employees had gathered near the entrance, watching the unusual scene unfold. Some whispered to each other, trying to understand why the CEO had personally chased after a rejected applicant. Even the interview panel stood outside, unable to believe what they were seeing. Michael glanced toward the building and then back at Daniel. "I honestly don't understand." Daniel gave a small, respectful smile. "You will." There was something sincere in his voice that made Michael pause. After a long moment, he nodded. "All right." The two men turned and walked back toward the headquarters together while every employee watched in stunned silence. No one knew why the billionaire CEO had stopped everything to bring one rejected candidate back inside. Not even Michael Carter had any idea that the answer waiting upstairs had been hidden for more than 20 years, and it was about to change the course of both their lives forever. When Michael and Daniel walked back into the building, the entire lobby had fallen silent. Employees who had been talking only moments earlier now stood still, watching the two men enter together. The interview panel looked completely confused. They had never imagined that a candidate they had just rejected would return beside the company's billionaire CEO. Daniel didn't stop to explain anything. He simply asked everyone from the interview panel to join him in the executive boardroom. Michael followed quietly, still unsure why he had been called back. Once everyone was seated, Daniel placed the old recognition certificate on the table. He looked at Michael for a few seconds before speaking. "Mr. Carter, there's something I need to ask you. About 22 years ago, did you work at Carter Industrial Systems under my father, Richard Bennett?" Michael looked surprised. It had been a long time since anyone had mentioned that company. He nodded and smiled slightly. "Yes, I did. I started there when I was young. Your father was a fair man. He gave people opportunities when no one else would." Daniel took a deep breath. "Do you remember an investigation involving one of our biggest suppliers?" Michael thought for a moment before answering. "I do. Some people wanted me to sign papers blaming another employee for missing inventory, but the reports weren't true, so I refused. It caused a lot of problems, but I couldn't lie just to protect someone's position." The room became completely silent. Daniel slowly opened a small leather folder that he had brought from his office. Inside was an old handwritten letter from his late father. The paper had faded over the years, but the writing was still clear. Daniel carefully read part of it aloud. "There was one employee who reminded me that a company's greatest asset is not money, but honesty. His name was Michael Carter. If you ever have the chance to work with him again, never let that opportunity pass you by." Everyone around the table looked at Michael in disbelief. The HR director lowered her eyes, realizing they had judged him only by the gap in his resume instead of the person he truly was. Daniel continued, "After my father passed away, I found this letter in his private office. I was young and I didn't know who Michael Carter was. Over the years, I forgot about the name, But today, when I saw your certificate and your resume together, I remembered everything." Michael looked genuinely surprised. He had never known Richard Bennett had written those words. To him, he had simply done what he believed was right. "I wasn't trying to be a hero," Michael said quietly. "I only told the truth. Anyone should have done the same." Daniel smiled. "Maybe they should have, but they didn't. You did." "My father believed that one honest decision saved his company from becoming the kind of business that valued profits over integrity. He often told me that leaders are remembered not for the money they make, but for the values they protect. Today, I almost made the same mistake everyone else did. I looked at a resume instead of the person behind it." The interview panel sat in complete silence. They realized they had spent the interview asking about career gaps, age, and job titles, but they had never asked the questions that truly mattered. Michael's experience had always been there in front of them, yet they had failed to see his character. Daniel looked around the room before speaking one final time. "This company was built on trust because of people like Michael Carter, and today we're going to make sure we never overlook someone like him again." At that moment, everyone understood that Michael had not returned to the boardroom because of luck. He had returned because the values he carried for more than 20 years were finally being recognized. The room remained quiet for several moments after Daniel finished speaking. Everyone expected the meeting to end with Michael being offered the operations manager position he had originally applied for. The HR director even slid the interview file across the table, ready to complete the paperwork. Daniel looked at the file, then gently pushed it back. "We're not going to hire Michael for this position," he said calmly. The words surprised everyone, including Michael. For a second, the room became completely silent again. Michael smiled politely and nodded. "I understand," he said. "I appreciate you explaining everything. Your father's words mean more to me than any job ever could." He stood up, believing the meeting was over, but Daniel quickly spoke again. "Mr. Carter, please sit down. I haven't finished." Michael slowly sat back in his chair. Daniel looked around the room before continuing. "The job you interviewed for was created to manage one department, but after hearing my father's story and learning the truth about the man sitting in front of us, I believe offering you that position would be thinking far too small." Everyone listened carefully as Daniel continued. "This company has grown into a successful business, but somewhere along the way, we've started judging people by polished resumes, expensive suits, and perfect career paths. We almost turned away the very kind of person this company was built to respect." Daniel then turned toward Michael. "I don't want you to become another operations manager. I want you to become our executive director of leadership and operations. You'll work directly with me. Your job won't only be improving our business. You'll help build a culture where honesty, responsibility, and respect matter just as much as profits." The interview panel looked at one another in complete surprise. It wasn't just a promotion beyond the original job. It was a position that had never existed before. Michael was speechless. He looked down at his hands for a moment before quietly asking, "Why would you trust me with something this important?" Daniel smiled. "Because my father trusted you without asking for anything in return, and after meeting you today, I understand exactly why." Michael's eyes filled with emotion. During the hardest years of his life, he had often wondered whether honesty had been worth the sacrifices. Sitting in that boardroom, he finally had his answer. The following Monday, the company held a meeting for employees across every department. Daniel stood on the stage beside Michael and shared the story of the forgotten letter. He never mentioned the failed interview. Instead, he reminded everyone that the strongest companies are built by people whose character cannot be measured on paper. He also announced new hiring policies that focused not only on experience, but also on integrity, leadership, and real-life responsibility. The employees applauded, and many later admitted that the story had changed the way they looked at every applicant who walked through the company's doors. That afternoon, Michael picked Emma up from school as he always did. She climbed into the car with a big smile and immediately asked the question she had been waiting to ask all day. "Dad, did you get the job?" Michael looked at her, smiled warmly, and squeezed her hand. "I went there hoping for a job," he said softly. "Instead, I found something much better, people who finally saw who I really am." Emma hugged him tightly, proud of her father not because of his new title, but because he had never stopped choosing honesty, even when life became difficult. Sometimes success doesn't come to the person who gives up after rejection. It comes to the person who quietly keeps doing the right thing until the right people finally notice.